Hello everyone, it's Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today I'm doing another budget top 10 decks. These seem to be quite popular videos, like to get some new people involved into the channel as well, maybe some newer players, trying to get into the card game. This could be a great opportunity to scout out what's really good right now, so let's hop into it. First, a few general tips. Proxy before you purchase is it's a good rule of thumb. Writing on cards, printing out text for certain cards, rather than just going out and buying, especially more expensive cards, like if you're considering buying a Shaymin EX, maybe just proxying, seeing how your deck functions with a Shaymin rather than without the Shaymin, could be a great way to define whether you need certain cards. Especially, again, you can proxy almost full decks at times if you wish, and get the playstyle of the deck before you actually go out and buy it. So I would definitely advise to proxy before you purchase cards. Yeah, that's a really nice tip. Also, there are certain cards which fit into a majority of decks, and you probably want to stock up on these if you're going to be considering joining the card game. So there are cards like VS Seeker, Professor Sycamore, Ultra Ball. Some of these cards you may not have read or you may not know what they do, but trust me, there are some staple cards which end up being in the majority of decks no matter what you're playing. So these sorts of cards are ones you're going to want to look out for, maybe talk to other players who are involved in the card game, or look at different decks online. Obviously our channel is a nice resource. You can just see patterns where you see lots of these sorts of cards popping up in pretty much every deck. So these are the cards you want to keep an eye on and definitely purchase. Oftentimes these are going to be supporters and item cards are the ones that pretty much slot into a bunch of different decks. Another nice tip is that tin promos of certain cards are released that are pretty much way cheaper to buy than their main set counterparts. So the main set is where you pull certain cards in boosters, but every few months I know that there's a new set of tins coming out very shortly. Actually, I believe it's in May, where you can get tins of Yveltal, Xerneas, and Zygarde, all fairly playable EXs for sure, and they're definitely going to be much cheaper than pulling them in the main set. Speaking of pulling cards, boosters, yeah, they're pretty fun, but it's actually way cheaper to buy singles. If you buy a bunch of boosters, even I like to buy booster boxes before or as soon as a new set is released. Oftentimes I buy 1 to 2, and even then I end up having to continually buy singles to fill out my collection and actually get enough copies of certain cards. So if you just go out, buy the cards you need for definite decks, it's going to be way cheaper than buying boosters, where you pretty much have almost enough cards to build a bunch of decks, but never enough to build one. Whereas if you just buy the singles, you've got a deck ready to go. So also hunt around for the best prices. Don't just go to the first website you can think of. Of course, there's going to be good offers all over the place. Even Facebook sites, if you can get involved in some of those, it's other players, so they're all doing fair prices. And yeah, good to shop around and see what you can get. Finally, borrowing and sharing collections with other people that you trust. If you have good friends, buddies, teams, even, you often see teams of Pokemon players who pretty much pool their resources so that different people can play a bunch of different decks at the same time. So, for example, if you have maybe, I don't know, 3 Vileplumes that you don't want to use, but your friend is trying to play Vespiquen Vileplume, you can let him borrow these Vileplumes, and in return he will give you, I don't know, a few Bronzongs for your deck, for example. So yeah, just a bit of give and take with friends can mean that you have more resources than you may have done to begin with, so that's pretty awesome. Next up, a quick little discussion on Shaymin EX. Shaymin EX is one of the most powerful and most expensive cards in the game right now, and basically the reason why these top 10 decks are budget decks is because they often do not use Shaymin at all. So it's kind of unfortunate the way things are going in the format where decks are cheap because they don't play Shaymin and nothing else, but that's how it is right now. So some decks can work with Shaymin, so if you do take the plunge and buy Shaymin, it's going to be used in almost every deck except for the ones on this list, ironically enough. So Shaymin can be good. It can also be included in some of these decks for sure, to give you that consistency boost, but pretty much these top 10 are decks that try not to use Shaymin EX, so that's pretty much why they're budget right now. So let's get on to the list. First of all, in at number 10 we have Houndoom Bunnelby. Oftentimes it's played with Vileplume as well, This is a mill deck, and the approach is basically to use the first attack of Houndoom EX, which is Melting Horn, discarding the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck. Combining this with Bunnelby, who can copy the same attack pretty much with Burrow, because he has the Barrage trait. You can use it twice to discard the top card of your opponent's deck. But you also have Rototiller to get back resources, and most of the resources you're going to recover with his second attack is going to be disruption item cards or supporter cards, so that your opponent runs out of energy or finds it difficult to attack or something like this. Bunnelby is really nice for doing that. So both of these cards, they're going to be very disruptive. Definitely in combination with Vileplume. It's actually top 8'd a City Championships, I believe in the UK. And yeah, very disruptive deck for sure. And because it's so disruptive, and just because you can get a turn 1 Vileplume, which item locks both sides of the field, you're not really worried about any matchup, because a whole bunch of different decks really dislike being under turn 1 item locks. So it really does just ruin the setup of certain decks. So even if something like Greninja, where it hits for weakness on Houndoom and it looks like it's going to be really bad, if you set up the Vileplume, sometimes they're going to miss Frogadier and you're just going to mill for a whole bunch of turns before they even get set up. So, you know, you're not really worried about any single matchup in particular, because you're just going to set out the same stall every game and say, you know what, I'm going to try and mill your cards before you can take 6 prizes. And that's basically how the deck functions. Couple of weaknesses. It's a mill strategy, and mill is pretty obscure. It's pretty much the least common way to win games of Pokemon currently. So if you are a beginning player, maybe this approach is not the kind of deck you want to pick up straight away. Maybe you want to do a more sort of autopilot, easy deck to play, because Houndoom Bunnelby, like I say, mill is just not very common. This is one of the only mill decks, along with another one that will be on the list later. So it's not too familiar for new players, and you won't really learn a lot by playing this deck in comparison to other decks, which sort of teaches you about prize trade and stuff like this. Very important concept in the Pokemon trading card game. A couple of other weaknesses. You'll end up purchasing a bunch of cards which may otherwise not be used. You know how earlier I was saying stock up on these staple cards where they fit into loads of different decks? Well, Houndoom Bunnelby will play a bunch of different cards that you won't be playing in a bunch of different decks. So you'll be buying high counts of AZ. Forest of Giant Plants only fits into a couple of decks, mainly Vileplume variants. So all of these sorts of 4-ofs that you'll just throw into the deck, stuff like Team Flare Grunt, Zerosic in really high counts, these sorts of supporters and items that don't really fit into every other deck will be needed to play Houndoom Bunnelby. So you'll be spending money committing to this deck alone, whereas if you buy some other decks in the list, you can have more transferable cards for when you're building another deck. Another issue is it can be kind of clunky, because you're having all these disruption cards and you're under Vileplume lock yourself if you're using the Vileplume build, which is probably the strongest. You're pretty much just drawing 1 card per turn, and you're pretty much just as locked as your opponent, really, in terms of what you can do in that turn. Most of the time it's just going to be announcing your attack or not, basically. Sometimes you can get a disruption supporter going off, but it's pretty clunky, so it's not the most fun deck to play. But if mill is your style, then this is one to look forward to. In at number 9, we have Hippowdon. Hippowdon's a pretty cool card. Basically, it all emphasizes on his first attack, which is Resistance Desert. It does 60 damage, and during your opponent's next turn, prevent all effects of attacks, including damage done to this Pokemon by Pokemon EX. The format is fairly EX heavy right now. There's quite a few out there. Mega Rayquaza, Mega Manectric. These would most likely be auto-win matchups for you, because they pretty much play no non-EXs. And even if Mega Manectric does play non-EXs, they're most likely going to be weak to Hippowdon, so you should be able to run through them fairly easily. However, there are some decks which are non-EX. Trevenant and Greninja, even Garchomp to an extent, these will be pretty difficult matchups. So you do have auto-wins, but you also have very difficult matchups, so it's pretty much... It's not very 50-50-ish. Hippowdon either easily wins games or quite easily loses games, so you have to bear that in mind when playing Hippowdon. A couple of other strengths. You do have the Karina engine, so you do have good consistency. You will often set up your Hippowdons. It's very easy to play. You're only ever really using the first attack. Sometimes you can use Double Edge if you're trying to finish off certain Pokemon. Maybe Lysandering up a Shaymin for finishing out the game could be an option. But most of the time you're just trying to set up Hippowdons turn after turn and make sure that you can continue to use the Resistance Desert attack. Also, because you are using a Karina engine, you get to search out different items. You have a lot of space for tech items, even one-ofs, stuff like a one-of Enhanced Hammer or Startling Megaphone. These can be thrown into the deck, and because we use Karina to search them out, they're oftentimes going to get value in certain matchups. So you can tech for different matchups in a way in this deck, because you have lots of space. All you really need is the Hippowdon line, maybe a couple of Seismitoad EX if you are bursting out the budget a little bit later on down the line. But to start with, at least, you can build to the budget and just start off with the Hippowdons, try and get them going early, and you have lots of space for disruption items as well. A couple of weaknesses: it itself is actually quite weak to energy denial. Jirachi promo can be an issue because oftentimes you're using double colourless energy in addition to strong energy, so stuff like Enhanced Hammer in Jirachi will be a bit of an issue for you. And the damage output is low-ish. It does start off with 60. Strong energy can bump it up to 80. Most of the time we will be using Focus Sash rather than something like Muscle Band, so it's looking at pretty much two-shotting EX Pokemon. But that's pretty bad when you're up against non-EXs because they can trade back on you most of the time. So Hippowdon, a pretty nice card. It's pretty win or lose, so bear that in mind. That's probably the biggest thing to take from Hippowdon. It's one that I definitely like for sure, and it's one to consider for sure. In at number 8, we have Wobbuffet Crobat. This is a deck that's been around for a while, so unfortunately it might be going out of the format fairly soon. That's not confirmed, but that's just the way Pokemon has been going lately. They've been rotating 4 sets at a time, and this is within those 4 sets if it ends up being rotated this year, so it's something to bear in mind. However, Wobbuffet is a very disruptive card, and it's a really, really powerful card for anyone who isn't aware of the deck. Ability lock from turn 1 is so huge a lot of the time. A lot of decks are reliant on Shaymin EX, like I was saying earlier, and even stuff like Greninja struggles without its abilities, so you can disrupt a whole bunch of different decks. His Psychic Assault attack is fairly decent, however it is variable. So you can see down here, damage output can be difficult for the opponents to calculate and play around, because most of the time we're just going to sit with Wobbuffet in the active position and have a bunch of bats on the bench doing their snipes with their own abilities, which don't get shut off by Wobbuffet because these are psychic types. And whenever you put down more bats, it pretty much racks up the damage with Psychic Assault, which does 10, plus 10 more damage for each counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. We can also use stuff like Super Scoop Up to reuse bats, and we can use Bursting Balloon as well to attach to Wobbuffet, so either they don't attack us or they do attack us and they receive 60 damage. Either way, you're pretty happy. Obviously, receiving the 60 means that your next Psychic Assault will be doing a whole lot more damage. If they choose not to attack, then you've basically freed up your Wobbuffet for return, and that's also very cool. Also, you have sniping and placing counters all around the board, so you have pretty much good control of the board state. You can go all out on the active position when you need to, or you can start targeting lower HP stuff on the bench if that's the certain matchup that you're in. Stuff like Night March, it may be way better to target your bats on the bench rather than the active position because they have such low HP already. Couple of weaknesses: without abilities of your own, you can have some quite clunky and awkward hands, especially because you're not only using a stage 2 line, but the stage 2 line is one that doesn't use rare candy, so you have to go from basic to stage 1 to stage 2. And oftentimes if you have hands where you have the Crobats without the Golbats, or you have the Golbats before Zubats are ready, stuff like that, it can be awkward. You have to sickle all these away and have to search them back out after using something like a Sacred Ash. These can be really awkward. So that's something to bear in mind. It's also ability focused. Even though we're actually locking abilities for the opponent, we ourselves are very focused in terms of the bats. So we are fairly weak to Hex Maniac and Garbodor. Finally, we struggle to Theta Stop decks. That's pretty much Sceptile is the biggest one right now because Theta Stop stops the opponent's abilities. So our bat drops don't do anything to Sceptile, so our output is pretty much 0 against that deck. And also Rough Seas is a card which is thrown in for stuff like Greninja and Manectric, and these can undo a lot of our bat's damages most of the time, so we're not too strong against anything with Rough Seas. However, against Greninja, Wobbuffet is a real star player, so I still think that matchup is fairly winnable, depending on how many stadiums you play. I think this is a really underrated deck, and it could see play in top tables in current format, so this is definitely... I've placed it low on the list just because of clunkiness, but if you build this deck right, it can be very, very strong and has pretty good matchups around the board, to be fair. In at number 7, we have Wailord Walls. This is basically since American Nationals, Wailord has popped up and is basically similar to Houndoom Bunnelby, where you're not trying to take any prizes in the game, you're just trying to mill your opponent. And the way we do this is look at Wailord's HP. 250 is way too much for pretty much any deck to deal with. So we're going to spam cards like Max Potion that you can see down there, as well as AZ and Cassius to pretty much keep healing Wailord every turn, so that your opponent can pretty much, we just undo everything they do every turn. And then we use energy denial cards like Zerosic, Flare Grunt, Crushing, and Enhanced Hammers, so that they run out of energy, and then we basically win. So it's fairly easy to play. You just have to not lose 6 prizes basically. So heal Wailord when you need to, disrupt your opponent's energy whenever able. Sometimes Lysander Stalling is a good option. Very easy to play. It does hard counter a couple of really popular decks in the format right now. Think about stuff like straight Seismitoad. Even Seismitoad Giratina really does struggle against Wailord. It's pretty much a win for you most of the time. Also, Night March, it's not the easiest matchup, but I feel like the Wailord player is slightly favoured, so these things are very good. Having good matchups against some popular decks right now is very cool. On the other side, the weaknesses, it is metagame dependent. Wailord is quite strong right now, but maybe down the line it's going to be a lot weaker. There are counters out there, stuff like Vespiquen. If this gets way bigger, Wailord becomes way worse. So you have to pretty much take Wailord with a pinch of salt. He pretty much comes up and down and play basically whenever the format's just right. Wailord will win events, but then he'll sort of peter out. People start countering him, and he just has no chance of winning. But then, just when the time is right, Wailord can sneak up again and take victories. So it's one to definitely keep in mind. Again, it's like I was saying with the Houndoom, the strategy is different with this deck to most. So not the best for beginners, although it is easy to play. It doesn't really teach you much about the game if you are just starting out. And like I was saying again with the Houndoom approach, you'll end up purchasing many cards which you otherwise would not be playing. Like 4 Max Potion, 4 Cassius, 4 AZ. Even stuff like Shauna to an extent. This is rarely used in any other decks. So Wailord, you end up having to buy lots of cards that you are just not going to use in any other deck. So do bear that in mind. In at number 6 we have Groudon. It's another deck that relies on Wobbuffet to stick in the active position, so you have that ability lock which is strong. You have the Karina engine, like I was saying with Hippowdon, so you have good consistency. He hits like a truck. Primal Groudon can hit 200 plus per turn once he is finally set up. He does take a while though, as you can see, with that amount of energy. He does have this barrier trait, which is the biggest thing about Primal Groudon, so he pretty much can't be disrupted in any way. So you can literally put yourself into board states where you cannot lose the game. If you have a Focus Sash on a Primal Groudon, he will not die unless he gets hit with something like a Bat Drop or Poison at the time. So even then you can use something like a Hex Maniac to deny something like Ariados or Bats to do those things. But in certain matchups, if you have a Focus Sash Primal Groudon, you will guarantee yourself pretty much 4 prizes, and that can just win you the game. If you've already got the first Primal Groudon going or whatever else. So he's a very strong card, very difficult to deal with, great against Seismitoad again, so that's something, a real big bonus. So, and yeah, like I was saying, unaffected by disruption thanks to his trait, which is very cool. Couple of weaknesses, sniping can be a real issue. Fright Night Yveltal is being played in a lot more Yveltal decks, also in some Vespiquen variants even. Yveltal's seeing play, the Fright Night, which can bench snipe, and that pretty much ruins the Focus Sash approach, and he can again become vulnerable. Crobat, like I was saying, is an issue. Again, we're trying to ruin the Focus Sash state. All of these things can do that. The playstyle is quite different. It's a very slow playstyle. You're submitting a lot of prizes early on just to set up Primal Groudon and hoping to pull them all back late game. So that's something that newer players may not grasp the concept of. So that's something to bear in mind. Also, Giratina is another issue for Groudon. There's plenty of issues for Groudon. It's just making the right deck, the combination to make Groudon really work. I feel like it does take a very good list of Groudon to do well. That's not to say that it can't do well, because when it shines, it really is a real threat. And you can literally put yourself in game-winning situations. So Groudon is one to look out for, which is also a very cool card. In at number 5, we have Bronzong Box. Bronzong can be paired with a whole bunch of different things. I call it Bronzong Box because he's pretty much the star player. Metal Links is the ability which allows you to attach a metal energy from your discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon. This can accelerate a whole bunch of different dudes: Aegislash, Dialga, Heatran, even Scizor EX if you wish. Tyrantrum and Giratina are a couple of dragon types which also benefit from Bronzong. So what I really like about the Bronzong Box deck is you can build directly to your budget, and once you're happy or when you want to continue investing into the game, you can buy more EX Pokemon and stuff like that. So you might want to start off with just Bronzong and a few Heatran and maybe 1 or 2 Dialga, 1 or 2 Aegislash, and then later down the line you think, you know what, yeah, I'm pretty happy with this Bronzong deck, let's turn it into Bronzong Dragons with the Giratinas and the Tyrantrums. Slightly higher end of the spectrum in terms of price for these EX Pokemon, but you can start off small and then build bigger, which is really cool, and it makes the Bronzong Box deck fairly flexible. You can tech for different tournaments and throw in different combination of cards to deal with what you're expecting to see, which is very nice. It's also fairly transferable to Expanded. Basically, you just need to buy the new Bronzors, which then gives you Heavy Ball, Searchable Bronzor and Bronzong, which is pretty cool. And you've still got a fairly well-functioning metal deck, so that's pretty good. And because Bronzong himself is just so versatile, you know that you can adapt along with the format, kind of like what I was saying earlier, sort of touching upon it. Couple of weaknesses: it is heavily ability focused, so Hexmaniac and Garbodor are threats for sure. Also Wobbuffet, I should have thrown that in there as well. And just in general, it can be slow. Night March is one of the most popular decks out there right now, and most of the time Bronzong will be outpaced, unfortunately, so you might have to make some text for that and be aware that sometimes you will just lose because you don't set up too quickly with Bronzong, unfortunately. In at number 4 we have Rainbow Road, another very cool archetype that's popped up fairly recently. It all based around this Xerneas and its very powerful attack Rainbow Force. It does 10 damage plus 30 more for each different type of Pokemon on your bench. So we're going to try and use a few different things. Octillery provides a good draw engine, which is a factor we'll see in the next few decks for sure. Very, very cool card. Zoroark is another good card that boasts a good ability, which helps freedom of movement for all your dudes, and also his attack as well. Mind Jack does 10 plus 30 more for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So you add in a pretty much disruptive element and a bit of control aspect to the deck. The deck has plenty of different threats it can provide. Even Golurk can be a threat against stuff like Greninja because he too has the Theta Stop trait. But the main reason for Golurk is because he has the ability Double Type, which means when you are Golurk, he's not only a Psychic, but he's also a Fighting type. So if you fill your bench with 5 Pokemon, with one of them being Golurk, that's essentially 6 Pokemon. And that means that Rainbow Force can one-hit KO EX Pokemon, which is very, very good. Xerneas already has nice typing. Resistance to Dark is very cool, and with that sort of HP, plus Fighting Fury Belt because you are a basic, gives you great matchups against stuff like Yveltal. You can hit really hard with Skyfield. You can even one-hit KO Mega Pokemon if you incorporate Skyfield to your build. It's fairly easy to play. Try and build up that Rainbow Force and get your Stage 1s out there, and it will remain in the format for a while. All of these cards are fairly new, for sure. The ability focus, again, Octillery, Zoroark, even Golurk to an extent. You need your abilities to be online a lot of the time, so that's not very cool. You have awkward hands. You are playing 3 different stage 1s, so if you have a pretty slow turn 1, it's going to mean your turn 2 is pretty slow as well, and then you're pretty much going to get outsped. Like I'm saying down here, speed can be an issue. We are needing 3 energy on our Xerneas, even with DCE. That's a 2 energy commitment. It can struggle against stuff like Night March a lot of the time. Night March often the bane of these sorts of decks that are really nice and creative, but unfortunately they just get outsped. So that's something to be aware of. But this is definitely a fun deck and very creative. I think it's a nice one for newer players as well because it really gets you thinking about a whole bunch of different options. Zoroark gives you options to play around with different attackers and really sets you up and is a great one for newer players, I'd say. So if I was a newer player, I think Rainbow Road would be one that I'd definitely consider. In at number 3 we have Gallade Octillery. It's a pretty nice archetype. It's pretty big in America, a lot of people like it, and it pretty much takes advantage of one of the strongest cards we have in format, which is Gallade. Usually he's played as a Maxie's hidden ball trick target, so you cheat him into play, but here we're using him as, as he was intended, a stage 2 Pokemon. So the strengths, you have an amazing search/draw engine combo with your abilities, so Premonition lets you look at the top 5, and then Octillery allows you to draw until you have 5 in your hand. So you look at the cards and then you draw into the ones you want. Pretty simple. On top of that, we have the Greninja engine, which is awesome. A cheap energy cost for just double colorless means you can play a very low energy to count, which is pretty cool. You hit convenient numbers, i.e. you can kill Shaymin EXs very easily, and that's pretty much the way you win games with Gallade Octillery, so that's awesome. And another big thumbs up for the deck is you use Focus Sash, so you're very difficult to knock out a lot of the time. Weaknesses, you do require continuous setup of stage 2s. If these Gallades continue to die, you need to keep replenishing them because they are your main attacker and pretty much the only attacker in the deck. Again, your ability focus, definitely the draw engine is the deck is way worse without this draw engine. You pretty much need it to keep cycling Gallades efficiently, so ability focus is an issue. It's not the easiest of decks to play. I've played it myself, and even now I feel like there's, even with my experience with the deck, there's potential misplays all over the place in terms of the way you're using your Premonition, the way you're using Abyss Hands, stuff like this, which supporters you're choosing to use. So it's not the easiest one for beginners, but it is definitely a powerful deck. People can play around the main strategy of the deck as well. Oftentimes you're trying to Lysander Shaymin and target Whistle Shaymin. If people are aware of what Gallade Octillery is trying to do, they will play around it and it becomes way harder for you. Also at the moment, many people are playing tool removal because of stuff like Fighting Fury Belt and Focus Sash, so Startling Megaphone is being played in a lot more decks, and that's a bad thing for Gallade because we are really relying on Focus Sash. In at number 2, we have another Fighting Stage 2 Pokemon. This is Garchomp. This is a really cool card. He plays very similarly to the Gallade deck, it's just that he hits harder. Turbo Assault is a really nice attack, 60, and you get to attach an energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. Very, very nice, helps you out against stuff like Seismitoad or any other disruption deck that's trying to get rid of your energy, pretty much makes it impossible. Bite Off is the main attack that does 80, and if it's an EX Pokemon, 80 more damage. Because it's a fighting type, we can use Strong Energy and Fighting Stadium to push that into one-hit KO range, which is really awesome. On top of that, Garchomp has Free Retreat, which is a really nice bonus. So here are the strengths. O-hit KO potential is huge, gives you great training against EX decks. Karina for consistency, and even Gibble's attack, Never Enough, helps you draw in the early turns, so you should be fairly consistent. Energy Excel from the discard, like I was saying, helps out against denial decks and helps you just stream Garchomps throughout the game. It will remain in format for a while. This is a very new card. That's a really good thing. Lots of space for tech, items, and supporters. Pretty much you're just playing a Garchomp line and then just energy, even a low count of energy. I say 10 is a maximum for Garchomp. So you have a lot of space for a bunch of other things. And again, Focus Sash is a real plus side. The weaknesses, you need to keep setting up stage 2s. It's pretty awkward. Even with Candy Garchomp that you can get with Karinas, it's not the easiest to keep setting up these Garchomps if you're getting hit turn after turn. Like I was saying, people are playing tool removal. This is really bad for the Focus Sash decks. And it does have a difficult time against the non-EXs. Greninja is an awful matchup. Trevenant's pretty difficult. Even Xerneas, to an extent, is pretty difficult. So he much prefers dealing with EXs than non-EX decks. And the format is pretty much shifting towards stuff like Greninja and Trevor right now. So Garchomp may not be the best pick right now, but definitely is an inherently strong card. And that leads us to our number 1. I've mentioned it a couple of times. Greninja is a really, really good deck. Not only is it a budget deck, and the best budget deck, it's actually one of the best overall decks right now. So that just shows it's a great time to get into the card game. Greninja would probably be in my top 5 decks right now in terms of power level. It's a very, very cool deck with a lot of... It's very fun to play. It's has the potential to do lots of things. Let's have a look at what it can do. First of all, let's talk about Frogadier. Frogadier lets you set up really nicely. His attack is called Water Duplicates for a single water energy, and he's just a stage 1, so on turn 1 or 2, 1 if you use a Wally, you can search your deck for 3 other Frogadier, and this pretty much sets you up for the entire game. So really, really nice engine. You're pretty consistent in what you do most games as long as you can get the Frogadier going. We have the potential to ability lock ourselves. Shadow Stitching is a really nice option for anything. Like I was listing on the list, anything that doesn't like abilities, ability lock gets weak against Greninja because we have that option. It's a new deck, so it's going to remain in format for a while. The pure number of counters that you put on the board can be nuts. Giant Water Shuriken is an ability, not even an attack. This is an ability that allows you to do 60, which is insane, and it's counters as well. It's not damage, so that's really awesome. And you can use more than 1 break in a turn, so you can get plenty of damage counters on the board without even attacking, which is insane. Rough Seas gives us good Trainer Lock matchups. We have a very strong Seismitoad, we have a pretty strong Trevenant, all thanks to Rough Seas and Rough Seas alone, basically. And like I was saying, good board control, because we can not only access the active Pokemon, but these snipers allow us to deal with the bench things if we need to. Weaknesses: Greninja itself is weak to ability. It's very ability focused, so it's weak to these ability lock. Some decks will continue to Hex Maniac you, and your output is pretty weak in those sorts of matchups, so it can be awkward. Opening turns are pretty much make or break for the deck. If you get the Frogadier going, you get your setup. If you don't get the Frogadier going, you're pretty much going to lose, so it's pretty much all or nothing in the opening turns for Greninja, but most of the time you should be fine. Also, you need to continually set up stage 2s and breaks, so these are essentially stage 3 Pokemon break evolutions of Greninja. However, Frogadier does help out that a lot. And finally, speed can be an issue. The deck definitely has potential to come back with so much damage that it throws out from pretty much turn 4 onwards once you actually start hitting these breaks. But in the opening turns, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose 2 to 3 prizes because you're not even attacking for damage with the Frogadier. So it's only really damaging once you get into the Greninja, and even then, you've not gone into the break just yet. So it's turn 3, 4, 5 where you start dominating the games, and until then, you have to pretty much deal with a wave of whatever your opponent throws at you, and you really can't do much back, so that's something to bear in mind. But that is the list, guys. I hope you really enjoyed these top 10 decks for the budget list right now. I'm going to come with more of these sorts of videos in the future. I'm sure this is good for newer players and even current players who are just trying to be sort of savvy and keep their budget low right now. So, like I say, it's been Joe from OmniPoke. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.